I was here last week, having returned from 8 weeks in India, but I was welcomed home by the flu bug in addition to all of you. So even though I remember being here, I remember it only vaguely. So I really feel like today I'm finally home, and it's very nice to see all of you, and I just wanted to greet you with a little more consciousness than I was able to muster last week. No matter what I looked like, a part of me was still spread like a pat of butter, I think, somewhere in the 10,000 miles of travel. I can't think of a more auspicious time to return to my family and home here than the beginning of the Easter season. Easter is such a strange mixture of qualities because on one hand, it is really the final celebration of the incarnation of Jesus, not merely with his crucifixion, but especially with his resurrection, which is to say the facing into the very worst fears, the very most fundamental misunderstandings that human beings have about the nature of life and the nature of God, and then have all of those fears dissolved and all of those myths exploded by the manifested freedom, immortality, transcendence, selfless love that is the story of Jesus. And in the tradition of his life, the epic celebration begins with this Sunday. And whether these stories are exactly accurate or not, they clearly represent the experience not only of the avatar, but of us as devotees in relation to him. And we must never underestimate the transforming power that the repeated concentration year after year on these sections of the Bible, these events in the life of Jesus, have as a potential to constantly reawaken us. I had the experience when I was traveling of meeting many people I'd never met in person before, although by the power of the internet, we all actually know each other much more than I expect. But still, I was meeting new devotees in new countries and new cities, and being able to talk to them about the same exact teachings that we celebrate here, the same principles of self-realization, the same consciousness of the same masters. And the more one lives on the spiritual path and experiences with others and experiences with oneself, the more deeply subtle these teachings and our relationship as disciples and devotees is revealed to be. It's so easy on the spiritual path to allow familiarity to cloud our perception of the greatness of things. This is not, of course, limited only to the spiritual path. The great nemesis of families, marriage, children, extended families, is that quality of over-familiarity, where we think because we know someone, have lived with someone for a long time, have seen this now grown man when he was just a temperamental little boy, we lose track of that power of divinity, which is always hovering just beneath the surface and just beyond our ability to see it. Reading the Bible, as is a very good habit at all times during the year, but especially, in this season when we're reading again and reliving these stories, the reality of the power and the commitment that Jesus brought into his incarnation and the implications of that for each of our lives. Every time I open that Holy Scripture and see it again, it's like I've never heard it before. We have to understand the life of Christ clearly through the principles of self-realization, because that's when it really begins to shine. Also, the reason that Yogananda emphasized so much, the New Testament. As he put it, it was the will of Babaji that the power of that incarnation be renewed in our understanding, not as a sectarian story of one unique religion, but as the ongoing presence of a divine avatar who came to awaken mankind forevermore for all those who would tune into him. The life of Jesus is no accident, and his power and success was not something that he just sort of stumbled into. When a self-realized master chooses an incarnation, it's with total deliberate intent, at the behest of the divine, to fulfill a powerful destiny and a powerful mission. He is not able, because of people's refusal to accept him, to have the same effect on everyone. But as many as received him, to each one of them he can give the power to raise our own consciousness and become exactly as he is. This is the plot of the divine drama. Individual religions try to make that specific, but it's not specific. It's absolutely universal. Self-realization is the unifying reality behind all these seemingly different paths to God. And Jesus was born at that time and in that place for that group of people, for that particular culture, for the ongoing power of that mission, to set the stage for Yogananda's coming centuries later. In the view of these masters, there's no time, there's no place, there's the eternal awareness of the infinite consciousness, which Jesus embodied in himself. Once he took a physical body, he became Jesus. He ceased to be the undifferentiated infinite. That infinite power now expressed through this one individual. We have really very few facts about the actual circumstances of his life. Many inferences have been drawn, probably many of them false, because what we know we had in Jesus was no accidental avatar, but one who came to bring this world-shifting mission, and to bring it with absolute fearlessness and complete understanding of why and what would happen and how that would play out. And even as a young boy, he separated himself from his parents and went to the temple and began his mission at the age of 12, was startled when his parents didn't understand that that was the only reason he was living. And then, according to Yogananda's teachings, very soon after that, Jesus left his family, left the community into which he was born, and went to the east, went to India, went to Tibet, and did his own deep and profound sadhana as an example to his disciples, and in who knows what way to fulfill another part of his mission, which was the devotees and the disciples that he must have encountered there. Swami Kriyananda recently made reference to Jesus traveling throughout India, to going to the Jagannath temple in Puri, to having an encounter with the priests there, to working with the priests there to get them to be more broad and less prejudicial in the way they approach their spiritual path. He was 18 years in India. It's a part of his mission we know nothing about, because the record of those years, it is said, was removed from the scriptures that we now have. Maybe in decades to come, a more complete record of those years will be there. But after those years of spiritual sadhana, when he had passed out of his childhood and his adolescence and was fully in the power of the incarnation that he had embraced, he came back. And he didn't come back because he, missed his family and he wanted to see his friends. He came back because the timing was exactly the right moment for him to follow through on what he was born to do, which in this case was there was a true remnant of Sanatan Dharma existing in the Jewish religion among certain of the Jewish people. There was also a corrupt element of that great religion that was a priesthood that was using the power that they had gained to oppress people and to keep the truth from people and to make people feel that their salvation depended upon the whim of the priests and not upon the individual's relationship with God. And Jesus stood powerfully in the midst of that, continuously and endlessly challenging the corrupt priesthood and urging and awakening people to stand against that which was wrong and to stand for that which was true. It was revolutionary, but not in any political or social sense. Yes, he ignored caste rules. Yes, he was not bound by social custom. Yes, he associated with people who were considered low class, and he was not honored by the in-group in society. He paid no attention to any of those things. But the revolution he was offering was a revolution of awakening intuition and awakening understanding of who we are in relation to God, who God is in relation to us. The image that he brought forth repeatedly, God is our Father. At the time, God was thought to be a judge, very difficult to please, and the priests were essentially the lawyers who had to determine for us whether or not we were acceptable. And people lived not in love and in happiness and in joy with God, but in great fear of inadequacy or failure, or in some mysterious way violating rules that they barely understood. And Jesus wanted to rip all that away, and literally, he went into the temple and he drove the money changers out. What were the money changers doing in the temple? Well, everybody had to buy their way into God's favor. They had to buy the right sacrifices. They had to have the right money offerings. The money changers were there to facilitate what was really a merchant relationship with God. This was the fury that Jesus expressed. You have made of the house of my Father a house of business and commerce. And it wasn't merely that, spiritual trinkets should not be sold outside a temple. It was that the relationship with God had been made one of business and not one of love. Now, of course, those whose livelihood and position in society and sense of well-being and even their own sense of pleasing to God was based on this entire system did not take lightly to this kind of challenge. Now think for a moment how much power Jesus had in order to be able to walk into circumstances such as this, long established by tradition, not questioned by anyone. I remember having a simple conversation with a Protestant minister in this area when we wanted to use his church, to rent his church before we had this one for a celebration related to Master. And when he heard that I presumed to believe that Master actually represented the teachings of Jesus, or that I could follow the teachings of Jesus through this manner, I remember the man drew himself up and said that, speaking of Yogananda, well, he did not presume to call himself a Christian, did he? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I mean, how did you come to own this? How did you become the arbiter of who can and cannot have a relationship with Jesus? Well, you see, it's easy for us standing in our position now to feel that way. But put yourself back at the time of Jesus, when he was considered a rabbi, which is to say a teacher in the tradition, because he was born and raised in it and had the charisma and the wisdom and the understanding to, in fact, out-debate their best, which was one of the reasons that he was so frustrating to everyone, because he had the power to do that. But he was going against everything that was established, and people had to decide. There was no established reality. I mean, now, even in the life of Yogananda, he came in 1920. He didn't write Autobiography of a Yogi. It wasn't published until 1946. And there were very few, in fact, virtually no other representatives of the Indian tradition in America. And when he arrived, he was himself a young man in his 20s. There was no context for you to understand who Yogananda was at that time except your own perception, your own intuition, and your own confidence in your actual experience. The life of Jesus was just the same. He wasn't inviting you to fit comfortably into the well-established system that you were raised in, where everything was all clear-cut and your sense of your own destiny was certain because everybody said it was. Instead, he was debating, he was arguing, he was challenging, and then those who were in power were becoming more and more threatened by him. And this whole drama took place over a period of only 3 years in what was really a very small universe of individuals who had known each other, many of them from birth, and families divided against families. Jesus himself said, "I did not come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword." I mean, what's implied by all of that? A child decides to follow this new rabbi instead of the established ways. The parents become panic-stricken that this child's salvation is being sacrificed. Those who are very powerful, maybe friends of the parents, warn the parents about what this child is into, and then that child has to experience, whether that child is a grown-up or a youth, doesn't matter, has to decide, what am I experiencing? Who is this man? Repeatedly through the Bible, the question is asked of Jesus, and Jesus asks others, who am I? Who do people say that I am? Who do you think that I am? Why would that question come again and again? Because Jesus has no credentials except the vibration of his own consciousness, and he's challenging everything. And he's not challenging it in a sort of casual way. You know, this is not a soccer game, the outcome of which has no consequence. This is everything about our lives. Why was I born? How should I live? What does God want of me? You know, what pathway will lead to satisfaction and to happiness? And then to follow Jesus becomes not merely an original choice, but actually a dangerous choice at a certain point. The priests had given the word that whoever knew where he was had to tell the authorities where he was. Now all of a sudden, you know, maybe it was just an impulse, just a lark, just going along with your friends that got you involved with Jesus in the first place. And now all of a sudden, I'm bound to report if I know where he is. Is that truth? Is that the moral thing to do? What will happen to me if I resist that power? Of what stuff am I made? Who do I want to be? Where does my truth and happiness come from? You know, this was no small experience, and it's the power of all of that. It's not merely that Jesus was nailed to a cross, which from our perspective in this century, although it was a common punishment at the time, you know, in and of itself, it just seems so horrifying to us. That was just the last act in a drama that was much more individual and in many ways much more important than just how one body has the soul and physical separated in one moment, because the body passes repeatedly. But even when the body dies, all we have is our consciousness. All we ever have is our consciousness. And where does truth and happiness lie? So the culmination of this life is the beginning on Palm Sunday. As David was reading in the Bible, Jesus had been in Jerusalem. He'd been close to the heart of the powerful people, and their antagonism toward him was growing greater and greater. The incident in which they picked up stones and wanted to stone him was there, when he was they were challenging him, and he was claiming to be an instrument of the Father. He was claiming to act in the name of God. He was claiming to be an expression of the divine. And that, in the orthodoxy of the times, was considered, blasphemous to such an extent that a person could be put to death for claiming that. So Jesus is there saying, not only am I an expression of the divine, speaking of himself, but so are all of you. And then even worse, he quotes their own scriptures at him, which in fury they just want to pick up stones because they can't beat him in debate. They don't have the magnetism to stop him. So the only thing they're trying to resort to is violence and the position that they have. And they're about to stone him, and different traditions are different, but many of the traditions say that Jesus would simply, at such moments, dematerialize. Which is, he was hard to find. Which is why they put out the word, if you know where he is, let us know where he is. You would think, how hard could that be to know where he was? But he had a way of not being where he was. They describe it as melting into the crowd sometimes. But we believe there was more at stake than that, because his hour had not yet come. And so finally it's the Passover, and it's the tradition for all the Jewish people, all the community, to go to Jerusalem to celebrate this great event. And of course, news is passed by word of mouth. And so wherever the crowds are gathered, the crowds are talking, and everybody knows about Jesus. They know that he had the confrontation with the priests. They were going to put him to death, and then he went away. They know also about Lazarus dying, being 4 days dead in the tomb. And Jesus shows up and calls the dead Lazarus out of the tomb. I mean, we can hear these stories over and over again, but if you actually stand there, and there was a large crowd standing there, when Jesus asked the stone to be moved aside and called Lazarus' name, I mean, they were all there because they were mourning with his sisters over his death. And his corpse had been wrapped up, and he'd been put in the tomb, and the tomb was closed. 4 days later, Jesus finally arrives, having delayed his arrival all this time. And he calls to Lazarus, and Lazarus stands up, and they describe, even in detail, he walks out with the winding sheet. He sort of staggers out, wearing what he was wearing when they put him in the tomb. Can you imagine? I mean, yes, we can imagine. But oh my gosh. So the sensation around Jesus, and then the conversation, was Lazarus really dead? Maybe it was a trick. Those sisters are pretty dedicated to him. And undoubtedly, I heard, someone will say, I heard, and just trying to find a way to not have it be what it was. Because you see, what will we do if these things are true? What will we do if every sort of convenient little box that we've built for ourselves, and this small world that we've decided is our world, and we have it all worked out in just such a way, what happens if someone pulls the top off and says everything I thought to be reality was not reality? What are the implications of that? And what am I going to do? And so Jesus comes to Jerusalem, which is an act of self-sacrificing folly, as he himself knew. Jesus is not even trying to protect himself. He knows that these priests are out to get him, and that the word has been given down that he should be arrested, and execution is the likely result, because he has blasphemed, and death is the result. And instead of hiding from that possible result, he gathers his disciples. He gathers the donkey to ride upon. And in some of the traditions, it talks about how he urges his disciples to escort him and to sing. And instead of sneaking in the back door, he triumphantly processes through the main gate. You are looking for me. Here I am. Right? As a story in itself, it's stunningly magnificent. as an example to all of us, just imagine, as a stream of consciousness that we can draw upon to empower and to guide our own lives, we couldn't do better. Now, the disciples now, of course, seeing him enter triumphantly, and his magnetism is such in that moment, Jesus, in essence, allows the flow of his consciousness to express itself, and everyone is drawn in. And when one of the authorities still says, "Rebuke your disciples," Jesus' answer is, "If they did not cry out, the very stones would exclaim." And what Jesus is declaring in that moment is, this is the power and the presence of the divine, and all of creation celebrates it. Now, the poignant intensity of what happens in the next 7 days is also what gives Palm Sunday such an extraordinarily affecting quality. Because the disciples naturally assumed that if he would go back to Jerusalem so openly and so powerfully, that this was not the end of his incarnation, but the beginning. That all the divine promise that his true followers had felt of who this man was, who he would be, how he would reform his people, how he would take back power that had long been denied to that whole community of people, they all assumed, because the mind goes in worldly ways, that divine power would then express in the way the ego would want it to express. And Jesus, of course, hints, but does not declare, and merely allows the story to unfold. And so the lesson of sing out Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the glorious freedom of being able to embrace heart, mind, and soul, the coming of the Lord, which is represented by Palm Sunday, is true. But the way that that power actually manifests in our lives also has to be understood and has to be embraced, if the full glory of God, if we will in fact receive him and become as he is, one with the divine. God bless you.